Sometimes the way different cultures phrase the questions that they ask philosophically has much to do with the way they answer those questions. And when we compare philosophical systems, we can see that maybe the reason that answers sometimes look so different is because the starting points, although close together, took a slightly different spin. Some people have suggested, people within the Western tradition, that the way the West has tended to think about human beings in relation to nature is a presupposition that has shaped a lot of our questions and therefore had a lot to do with the answers that we've given. And some of these critics suggest that this has been a real problem. They point to the fact that currently we face a lot of environmental problems, and they suggest that perhaps many of these are owing to the fact that we have typically viewed human beings as the masters of nature. One proposal is that perhaps the West should learn something from the American Indians in this regard. Two of the thinkers that propose this are Thomas W. Overholt and J. Baird Callicott, who I'll be talking about to some extent later in this lecture. They draw on the ideas of Aldo Leopold, who proposed what he called a land ethic. A passage from Leopold will give you some impression of what this land ethic is supposed to be. Leopold states, "All ethics so far rest on a single premise, that the individual is a member of a community of interdependent parts. The land ethic simply enlarges the boundaries of the land community to include soils, waters, plants, and animals, or collectively, the land." In other words, traditionally, any kind of ethical thought has assumed that the individual human being is in relationship with others and that moral obligations have to do with those others. But Leopold points out that typically in the West, we've tended to focus only on a community of other human beings, whereas we can expand that vision to seeing ourselves as a component of a larger unity, a unity that includes the natural world as a whole. And typically this is what American Indian societies did. In this lecture, we'll be talking about some generalizations about American Indian societies. And I think it's important to note at the outset that this is, in every case, a bit of an exaggeration. After all, there were some 2,000 Indian tribes in the American continents when Christopher Columbus arrived. And obviously, those tribes have differences of opinion. In the last lecture, we pointed out that even within specific groups, there are always some differences of philosophical opinion. Nevertheless, the kinds of things that we're going to talk about here are some important contrasts between what we might call the general Western worldview, which we've been discussing, and the American Indian worldview, allowing for the fact that tribes sometimes had slightly different ways of articulating these themes. To make this comparison, again, we ought to review some of the things that we've talked about so far as being characteristic of Western thought. One kind of recurrent theme is that the real is what's eternal, what doesn't change. Similarly, the West has tended to think that the self, the human being, was something that was particularly individual, and in fact usually thought of as a soul, something that doesn't change even beyond death or continues beyond death. Again, this preference for the unchanging. Moral responsibilities were articulated primarily in terms of human beings. We saw that Kant extended this to other beings that had reason, although he left it sort of open-ended as to who those other beings for the most part were, beyond God and maybe angels. But in general, why do we have moral responsibilities? According to Kant, because human beings, like other rational beings, have dignity precisely because they're rational. He doesn't discuss moral responsibilities to other creatures because he doesn't consider other creatures on this planet, at any rate, to be rational. A Western notion that we haven't really focused on, but I think is implicit and widely assumed, is that human beings have dominion over the earth, that we're basically the masters of the rest of the natural world. We've spoken of the way that time is thought to be linear in the West, and also that reason is the primary means to come to know things. Finally, a further theme that I want to focus on a bit in this lecture is the fact that the spiritual and the material are considered to be different orders of being. We notice this in the thinking of Descartes. His claim is that the mind and the body are two different kinds of things. The mind for him, which is the thinking substance, is essentially the soul, which is spiritual and continues to exist beyond this life. The body, on the other hand, is material. That's a very different kind of thing, and something that the soul can be detached from. American Indians tend to approach the world very differently on all of these points. First of all, the assumption is that the natural world is reality, not some world that doesn't change, certainly not, as Plato saw it, a realm that exists somewhere else other than this one, but instead the natural world that we see all around us. Moreover, we are related to everything that we see around us in this world. Human beings are kin of the earth, of animals, of other creatures, of trees, and so on. There's an interdependent ecology, and as a consequence of this, human beings do not have a kind of special dominion over everything else. Instead, human beings are the caretakers of this whole interdependent world. Time, similarly, is not viewed as something that is basically a distraction from eternal verities. Instead, time is viewed as something cyclical. It isn't linear, as in the West, but instead focuses on natural cycles, patterns that recur. Reason is not the only means to find out what's really important. As we'll see, certain other much more intuitive kinds of ways of coming to know things are taken extremely seriously. And finally, American Indians tend not to make a sharp distinction between the spiritual and the material. Indeed, the two are felt to be completely interpenetrated. We'll consider each of these themes in turn. First of all, the notion of the changing world around us being reality. The world is seen as basically a system of interconnected beings, and all of those beings are energy processes. We as human beings are not mainly body that somehow has a thinking substance attached. Instead, we ourselves are energy, and we interact with all kinds of other beings, themselves energy. The whole natural world is even thought of as a being. The earth is considered to be alive. Now, this is certainly very different from a rather typical notion, I think, in the West, that the earth is something like inert stuff until human beings or some creature does something with it. Instead, the earth itself is viewed as a spiritual being. That's a kind of process, not something that is inert or inanimate. The American Indians tend to have a notion of a spirit that animates the whole, and this spirit is sometimes referred to as the Great Spirit. It has, of course, different names in different Indian languages. Wakantanka is the Lakota name, the same tribe that's often called the Sioux, and I'll be referring to the Great Spirit in that term because I'll mostly be referring to Lakota Indians in this lecture. Gitche-Manitou also refers to this notion of the Great Spirit. This is the Algonquin term, and the Pawnee use the term Tirawa. The idea of the Great Spirit was that there was a fundamental God-like being, supreme being, that's manifest everywhere in the world as a whole. And interestingly, this notion of the Great Spirit is not anthropomorphic in the sense that we often find religions to talk about gods or fundamental spirits. By saying that it's not anthropomorphic, what I mean is that there isn't a lot of specification. You don't get the notion that the Great Spirit is an actor in various myths. Most Indian societies do have myths. Indeed, they have gods that appear in myths. But the gods, too, are a manifestation of this more central, fundamental being. Indeed, the reason that it's not a very specific kind of description is because the assumption is that the same Great Spirit exists in everything. So you're not going to be able to differentiate it from anything else. The Great Spirit exists everywhere. As a consequence of this lack of specificity, at times the Great Spirit seems a rather vague notion. And yet there's a real intimacy that the American Indians feel toward the Great Spirit. Black elk and lame deer, two Lakota elders, talk about the Great Spirit as grandfather, which I think suggests something of both the amorphousness of it, but the immediacy of the relationship. Grandfather suggests maybe a relationship that's not quite as immediate or as direct as the relationship to one's parent, but nevertheless, it's a relationship of great intimacy. And as we'll see in discussion of the Great Spirit, the idea of the Great Spirit's presence everywhere and sustaining power is really important. Each of us, of course, has a relationship to the Great Spirit because we, in fact, manifest the Great Spirit. but we're also kin of every other kind of thing in the world. The American Indians tend to be what's called panentheists. This is a technical term about a certain kind of theology, and it's related to a term that I think is a little bit more well known, pantheism. The idea of pantheism is that everything in the world, or the world itself, manifests God. There's not a separation between God and the world, but instead the world is the manifest presence of God. Panentheism instead focuses on the particular things in the world, although it is a form of pantheism. And the claim in panentheism is that each particular thing manifests the same Great Spirit. So in a sense, that when we encounter other beings, whether they're human, animal, vegetable, whatever, we're encountering the same being that we ourselves are, namely this Great Spirit. And this makes a connection extremely intimate between all the beings of the natural world. All creatures, because again, they are manifesting the same Great Spirit, are considered to be persons in a sense. And each creature has its own good. In Western thought, when we read Aristotle, Aristotle talks about the good being what everything aims at. So human beings aim at their own good. Animals aim at their own good. In other words, each kind of being has particular conditions that are going to make it thrive. And that's what each being aims at. This notion, or a similar notion, appears in the thought of the American Indians, that each creature does have its own conditions for thriving. And this very fact gives us certain obligations to all creatures. Each creature ought to be able to thrive, to find those conditions, and we ought to do what we can to assist that. If a being has a body, according to this way of thinking, it also has consciousness. So the notion that we sometimes have that human beings are like us because they share consciousness, but you occasionally hear, for instance, Western philosophers these days still asking the question, well, are animals conscious? I mean, after all, they don't seem quite like us. They don't talk to us. This is a line of thought that was already present in Descartes, and it's certainly very contrary to the spirit of American Indian thought. For the American Indians, all creatures have their own knowledge, their own awareness of things, and in fact, we can learn from them. As Lame Deer puts it, all creatures have secrets to tell. And if we're wise, we'll learn from other creatures as well as from other human beings. An assumption of many Indian tribes is that human beings can in fact turn themselves into animals or be turned into animals and communicate with a whole species in that way, bringing insights back to the human community. In any case, a very important distinction between American Indian thought and Western thought is the emphasis placed on obligations to animals and to the earth as a whole. American Indians view the relationship between human beings and animals as one that causes certain responsibilities for human beings. This is a rather interesting feature of American Indian thought because, in fact, a lot of American Indians were traditionally hunters. So you might think that something like concern for the animals isn't very evident in their way of life. Quite the contrary. The notion was that hunting, although the way of life that sustained the Indians, was something that was really a kind of gift exchange between animals and human beings. That you needed to maintain good relationships with animals in order to be successful hunters. And that, in effect, both sides had certain responsibilities. So in order for human beings to play their part, it was essential not to avoid hunting animals, hunting was the way of life, but to thank animals when they gave themselves in the hunt. The idea was that animals actually allowed themselves to be hunted, and not only that, allowed themselves to be successfully hunted. So a certain kind of relationship needed to be maintained in order to be a good hunter. It was also obligatory for human beings, when they were successful in hunting, not to break the bones of animals. The idea was that bones needed to be returned to their proper element, and this depended on the kind of animal it was. I'm going to mention a story about beavers, and in this case, if you hunted a beaver and had the bones left after eating, then it was important to take those bones back to water because beavers lived in the water. In a sense, it's a little bit like burial, you might say. We have the sense of returning a human being in the Christian tradition, the notion of be unto dust you shall return, the notion that the proper element, the element that would come from is the earth, and therefore burial is the appropriate thing to do. In this case, extends to a notion of what to do with animal bones after a successful hunt. And also a sense of cooperation with the animals, an appreciation of the animals. And she decides to marry the man when he asks her to marry him. And only gradually does she realize that this wasn't a human man at all. It was actually someone else in the form of a man. She discovers, for instance, when the man takes her home, that he has a beautiful house. And also it turns out that whenever they have children, they have 4 at once. So these are little details that suggest that this person is actually a member of the beaver tribe. After all, beavers build beautiful homes. Beavers do have litters of 4. So she gradually comes to realize, I've married a beaver. And in the course of the story, the notion of trade comes up as what's going on between the beaver population and the human population. Overholt and Callcott narrated as follows. Now and then by a person were they visited. Then they would go to where the person lived, whereupon the people would then slay the beavers. Yet they really did not kill them, but back home they come again. That was a time when very numerous were the beavers, and the beavers were very fond of the people. In the same way as people are when visiting one another, so were the beavers in their mental attitude toward the people. Even though they were slain by the people, yet they really were not dead. They were very fond of the tobacco that was given them by the people. At times they were also given clothing by the people. So there's a sense of something very much like economic trade going on. The people give the beavers certain kind of things, and although they kill them, it doesn't really kill them completely. The animals aren't fundamentally dead. Part of the notion here is that the animals recur, they return to Earth. You might view this as a kind of way of articulating the fact that even though individual animals of a species were hunted, nevertheless the species came back again the next year. And this was understood to be literally a reincarnation of the bones when properly taken care of. Interesting in this whole notion of this being an economic exchange is that the animals are obviously willing to be caught. Continuing the story, Overholt and Callcott say, if anyone regards a beaver with too much contempt, speaking ill of it, one simply will not be able to kill it. He who never speaks ill of a beaver is very much loved by it. In the same way as people often love one another, so is one held in the mind of the beaver. Particularly lucky, then, is one at killing beavers. Now, I think this is a very non-Western way of looking at hunting. I think one of the last things that many Westerners would think when hunting animals is obviously these animals love us very much, otherwise we wouldn't be successful. But we have again this notion of a real reciprocity and mutual respect between human beings and the animals they depend on. Human responsibilities also extended to the land itself. And the American Indians tended to think that it was really a sign of great disrespect to the land to enclose it or to make it private property. So both of those things were forbidden. Land was viewed as the world that everyone shared and lived in. So taking it over privately and personally was not allowing this flow of energy to continue and the whole ecological system to flow its natural course. Human beings were required to conserve and protect the land as much as they could. And again, it's a part of this notion that we're all an interdependent ecology. The image of circles appear a lot in American Indian discussions of the natural world. And this notion of circles, I think, certainly reflects the idea of interdependence. But also it reflects the idea that all beings were thought to be powers. If you think of a circle as something that emanates concentrically, power could be thought to be concentrated at some point but emanate in a circle beyond it. Some Indian tribes actually talk about the center of the world being where one is. And what they mean by that is that one's own point is a point that is a circle emanating into the broader world. And our own reality extends into the broader world, as is the case for every other being. So the natural world involves all these circles, and in a sense, all these circles of points emanating beyond themselves itself is a circle. Lame deer and black elk both use the notion of circle to articulate the way in which the natural world works together. Lame deer, for example, says the following: "The teepee was a ring in which people sat in a circle, and all the families in the village were in turn circles within a larger circle, part of the larger hoop that was the 7 campfires of the Sioux, representing one nation. The nation was only a part of the universe, in itself circular and made up of the earth, which is round, of the sun, which is round, of the stars, which are round. The moon, the horizon, the rainbow, circles within circles within circles, with no beginning and no end." This notion of circles not only expresses a kind of sense of interaction, but it's also a rather natural image of reciprocity. We might compare King Arthur's notion that having a round table would indicate that everyone was an equal participant. And this too fits this notion of not treating human beings as some special kind of being that has dominion over all the others, but instead there's real reciprocity that extends outward. I think it's also interesting to compare this view to a current view proposed by Peter Singer, a proponent of animal rights and an animal rights activist, who claims that naturally we tend to concern ourselves with those beyond us. And initially we do this only very gradually. We concern ourselves with our family, with our friends, but gradually we come to have a larger sense of those who properly belong to our world and to whom we have responsibilities. And he sees concern for animals being a widening of this circle. So if moral maturity involves moving beyond just concern for yourself or concern for yourself and your family to concern for a larger community, then concern for the animals is a natural conclusion as he sees it. The American Indian view of time is also understood in terms of circles. As Lame Deer puts it, nature wants things to be round. The bodies of human beings and animals have no corners. And this is certainly so with respect to time. Black Elk describes the life of a human being in terms of a kind of cyclical process, something that's in keeping with the cyclical processes of nature more generally. He says, "The life of a man is a circle from childhood to childhood, and so it is in everything where power moves. Think of this. Is not the south the source of life? And does not the flowering stick truly come from there? And does not man advance from there toward the setting sun of his life? Then does he not approach the colder north where the white hairs are? And does he not then arrive if he lives at the source of light and understanding, which is the east? Then does he not return to where he began, to his second childhood, there to give back his life to all life, and his flesh to the earth whence it came? The more you think about this, the more meaning you will see in it." As for coming to know the world, this relational model has a lot of implications. Epistemologically, that is in terms of knowledge, the American Indian view of things differs again from the typical vision in the West, where reason is the predominant mode for knowing. Instead, the American Indians believe in shamanism, the practice of medicine men, who come to know things by means of what's called mystical participation. In other words, they come to participate or connect with another kind of creature and learn the secrets that that creature or that type of creature has to tell. Joseph Campbell describes what shamans do as going on psychological journeys, which he would say in our language is something like investigating the deep layers of the psyche. For the shamans in American Indian tribes, the way of understanding this is to say that a shaman has visions. And in particular, a shaman becomes a shaman with an initial vision that involves a connection to a particular animal. That gives that shaman a particular set of obligations to that animal. That whole species of animals is not an animal that that particular shaman should hunt. And insights come from this connection with that species. Sorcerers also participate mystically. And so the fact that one is able to connect with another being in this way is not necessarily a sign that one is a healer. A bear is viewed as a particularly wise kind of animal, but sometimes sorcerers also appear as bears. And they also manipulate the dreams of other people in order to manipulate them in waking life as well. Dreams are another mode of knowing reality from the point of view of American Indians. And this is certainly rather different from the view that we have with Descartes, who thought that a way to say that something that we think is true might be false is to say, for all we know, it could be a dream. Very obviously, he thinks there's a big difference between what we can trust and rely on and what we experience in dreams. But the American Indians tend to think of waking and dreaming as continuous with each other. And in fact, the dream life might be more informative to us than that which we encounter in the everyday. For example, Black Elk says sometimes dreams are wiser than waking. And the assumption is that in dreams, our spirit leaves the body and encounters other spirits. And so what one learns in this way is something that can be viewed as a higher truth, because one encounters other beings in their more essential form. And practical knowledge can come from dreams. How to use certain kind of healing herbs, for example, is thought often to be something that's passed along by means of dreaming. Black Elk describes the dreams of one of the members of his tribe called Drinkswater, and this is a dream that he had that forecast what was going to happen to his society. According to Black Elk, Drinkswater dreamed that the four-leggeds were going back into the earth and that a strange race had woven a spider's web all around the Lakotas. And he said, "When this happens, you shall live in square gray houses in a barren land, and beside those square gray houses you shall starve." They say that he went back to Mother Earth soon after he saw this vision, and it was sorrow that killed him. In this case, Drinkswater is seen as having, in a dream, come to understand the destination of his people, the very tragic destination that was going to overtake them. And this is something that is viewed as not really that atypical, particularly for someone like Drinkswater, who is a spiritual teacher and spiritually sensitive. Related to this idea that one can be spiritually sensitive beyond oneself is a sense that the material world is something that we can be sensitive to as spiritual as well. Indeed, there is no sharp spirit-matter distinction of the sort that we sometimes make in the West, or more typically make in the West. Everything in nature has a sacred character. And some people have pointed to the fact that rituals for American Indians often bring to the fore the fact that everyday things actually have a spiritual dimension. Sam D. Gill talks about the Kachina initiation ceremony among the Hopi, where the children who are being initiated, becoming adults in the society, at the very end have a horrible discovery. Up until this point, all their lives, they've occasionally encountered Kachinas, who are considered to be gift givers, clowns, maybe people that would eat the naughty, and they expect that these are what they will become in the next life. But at the end of the initiation ceremony, the Kachinas take off their masks and the children suddenly realize they're men of the tribe. This is a really upsetting moment, possibly comparable to learning that there is no tooth fairy or there is no Santa Claus in Western American society. And Gill points out that it seems like a very disillusioning kind of thing to do to children. But what it does is teach them not to trust appearances so much, to take appearances with a grain of salt, and also to realize that even the everyday is actually tremendously sacred if you only know how to see it. So that when one encounters the Kachina and thinks, this is a kind of different being from our everyday humanity, it turns out that no, this is just the very elders of the tribe, same people that we know in everyday life, but now seen in a sacred dimension. So the disillusionment turns into a new kind of awareness, where everyday life actually is a source of great spiritual understanding. I'll close with a quote from Lame Deer, who I think summarizes this nicely. "But I'm an Indian. I think about ordinary common things like this pot. The bubbling water comes from the rain cloud. It represents the sky. The fire comes from the sun, which warms us all. Men, animals, trees. The meat stands for the four-legged creatures, our animal brothers, who gave of themselves so that we should live. The steam is living breath. It was water. Now it goes up to the sky and becomes a cloud again. These things are sacred. Looking at that pot full of good soup, I am thinking how, in this simple manner, Wakantanka takes care of me." Thank you.